All right, we are live on YouTube and live in Zoom. Hey everybody, happy Friday. Welcome to our Emancipatory Education Speaker Series. We're going to get started in a moment. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and just make sure you send it to all panelists and attendees instead of all panelists. I'll go ahead and add myself in the chat here. I'm over here in Pleasanton, which is over in East Bay. So if you want to let us know where you're tuning in from today, go ahead and do that, and we'll get started soon. Katie's joining us from El Cerrito. Awesome. Welcome, Katie. Got a couple of our panelists chiming in the chat. Westminster, San Jose, nice. If you're joining us again this week too, if you've been here, if you joined us last week for our speaker series event today, let us know in the chat as well. Allison from San Jose. Denisa, hey, over there in Texas. Hope you're doing all right. Jennifer's joining us over in Chicago. Diley in San Jose, awesome. Hanging in there, good. It's good to hear. Got Amy over in Santa Cruz. We'll give everyone another minute to filter into the webinar. For those of you who just joined, welcome to the Emancipatory Education Speaker Series. We'll get started soon. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and just make sure you select all panelists and attendees instead of all panelists. Hey, Noni. Bella down at Huntington Beach, awesome. Hey, Jackie, good to see you. Thanks for joining us, both from over Minnesota. Roman's over in Jersey City, awesome. Got folks from all across the country in here. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone again to the Emancipatory Education Speaker Series sponsored by the Lurie College of Education at San Jose State and the SJSU Division of Student Affairs. My name is Brian. I'm just here to orient you all to the space today and let you all know that a recording of this event will be available afterwards at the URL where you RSVP'd, and we'll send that out to you all. Captions are available in the Zoom webinar as well. You can just select the captioning option in the bottom of your Zoom window. Those of you who are attending today, your video and audio is automatically turned off, so you don't have to worry about being visible in the webinar today. Please use the chat to communicate with one another and to communicate with our panelists. And today's speakers will answer questions after their remarks. So now I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to our Dean, Heather Lattimer, to welcome you and orient you to our college and a few other initiatives that we have going on.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to everyone for being here today. We are thrilled to be able to welcome you to the Lurie College of Education and San Jose State University. You see on there our mission statement that we developed a couple of years ago as part of our strategic planning work. And at our college, we've got about 2,000 students that are part of our college, part of the larger San Jose State campus. And the San Jose State campus has been named as one of the most transformative in the country. And we believe in our college that we're committed to preparing transformative educators, counselors, therapists, school and community leaders who are going to do that work in our schools, in our communities, and in our community college system, as well as right here at San Jose State, to ensure that every student has access to a high quality, meaningful, purposeful education. We use an emancipatory approach across our teaching, our scholarship, and our service, with the idea of looking critically at the systems and the structures around us and ensuring that we're asking hard questions and working to support our students, not only in navigating the system, but to change the system so that they better support our students, our communities, and our families. This series is a part of that work of really asking hard questions and looking critically at our systems. And we had a great session last week. I would encourage you to check that out. It is available on our website and has the recordings of both Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Dr. Jonathan Rosa, who provided some really thoughtful comments, some really good food for thought as we think about how to come back from COVID. That was the foundation for this conversation. Was we know that COVID has exacerbated many of the opportunity gaps, many of the inequities and injustices, and further exposed them so that more people are aware of those inequities and injustices. And as we think about coming back, we don't just want to come back to normal, because normal didn't work for too many of our families, too many of our children, too many of our communities. So what do we want to come back to? Once we're able to put COVID in the rearview mirror, what is the reality that we want to be able to come back to in our educational systems P20? And how do we get there? And that was the question that was posed to our panelists. As I say, we had some great conversations last week, and we're really excited today to be able to welcome Secretary John King and Dr. Leslie Gonzales to share their thoughts and to engage with you in that larger conversation. We would encourage you to come back next week. Next week, we have a Latinas Leading School panel, as well as Dr. Tara Yoso, who are going to speak. And then the following week, we'll wrap it up with Dr. E.J.R. David and the Disability Justice panel. That's really going to, I think, be significant in broadening and pushing our thinking and our understanding. So please do join us for those future events as well. And if you want to engage further in the college, a couple of opportunities just to highlight. One is our Emancipatory School Leadership Program for people who are K-12 aspiring school leaders. This is a program, it's a 12-month program from summer to summer. We have an application deadline coming up soon, and we started this last year, and the students who are in this initial cohort, we have heard just glowing comments from them about how inspirational it has been and how much it has pushed them and provided them with the tools to really do the work that they are committed to around transforming schools. We would encourage you to check out the website where Abby shares a video of her experience in the program, and there's some additional information for you to check out there as well. So if you are an aspiring school leader or know an aspiring school leader, encourage them to think about joining our cohort in the coming year. And then also I want to highlight our teacher education and special education applications are open. So if you're interested in pursuing a multiple subject, single subject, or educational specialist credential, or know of somebody who is, those applications are still being accepted. And for those who are in San Jose and committed to the San Jose region, we offer an Impact San Jose Fellowship that is about how do we provide support for people who are committed to the region and really want to be able to have that impact in the region. It not only provides financial support, it also provides access to residency programs and a great network of like-minded individuals who will be able to support you on your journey while you're at San Jose State and beyond into your first years of teaching. So would encourage you to think about that as well. So with that, I will pass the mic over to my friend, Jennifer Husbands. Dr. Jennifer Husbands is a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation and a member of our Institute for Emancipatory Education Advisory Council. And she's going to introduce her friend, Secretary John King.
Thank you so much, Heather, and welcome everyone. I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to welcome John B. King Jr. to the Emancipatory Education Speaker Series. John is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, an organization that advocates fiercely to close opportunity gaps that disproportionately affect students of color and students experiencing poverty. He served as the 10th US Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama, after serving as Deputy Secretary prior. Prior to that, he was the first Afro-Latino New York State Education Commissioner. John has also taught high school and served as a middle school principal. You can read more about him on the EdTrust website. His credentials are more than impressive, but that's not what inspires me about John King. What inspires me about John King is his deep-seated passion for educational equity. I'm starting to wonder if he has in fact cloned himself as I see him speaking on these very issues of what education recovery needs to look like in a post-COVID world, multiple times a week. John is also someone who is not afraid to make the personal political as he weaves in his own story of growing up in New York City and the roles that his teachers played in nurturing his own identity and intellect, and in providing him with the sense of hope for his own future. And while his scope is national, he serves on a number of boards, for example, he founded Strong Future Maryland last year in 2020, amidst all of this crisis, to help his now home state of Maryland recover from and rebuild from the COVID-19 crisis. So to speak colloquially, John really is all that in a bag of chips. And I look forward to listening and learning right along with you all as he shares his perspectives with us this afternoon. John?
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Dean Lattimer, for the opportunity to join the community today for this conversation. I'm going to start as a former high school social studies teacher with a quote from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass said, "Education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which men can only be made free." And I start there because for me, the promise of emancipatory education is really about giving students the opportunity to have transformational educational experiences. And as Jennifer said, I come to this work having been the beneficiary of exactly those kinds of experiences. I grew up in New York City. I was the son of two public school educators. My father, African-American, born just after the 20th century in a very segregated New York, saw a path to opportunity as a teacher and principal. My mother was born in Ponce in Puerto Rico, came to New York City as a kid, learned English in the New York City public schools, became a teacher and a school counselor. She was actually the school counselor in my elementary school when I was a kid. But my parents couldn't have known the difference public education, New York City public education, would ultimately make in my life. They both passed away when I was a kid. My mom, when I was 8, in October of 4th grade. My dad, when I was 12. And in between, I lived with my dad. It was just the two of us, and my father was sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was this place that was scary and inconsistent and unstable. But the thing that saved me was school. School was a place that was consistent and nurturing and engaging. I had a series of amazing New York City public school teachers who quite literally saved my life. The experiences I had in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, I remember like it was yesterday. We read the New York Times every day. We did productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did a production of Alice in Wonderland. I was the rose in Alice in Wonderland with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. And I remember those things like it was yesterday because it was freeing. It was liberation for me from the situation I was in at home. At school, I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. And so when I think about this notion of emancipatory education, I think about what would it take to make sure that every kid has the kinds of opportunities that saved my life, high quality, nurturing experiences in school. And so I want to argue that there are several things that we would need to do very differently as a society if we were going to deliver that to all kids. And this has been made even more urgent because of the COVID-19 crisis and the impact it has had on the health of our communities, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, the impact it's had on the economy, which has disproportionately harmed low-income communities and communities of color, and the impact it's had on education, where low-income students and students of color have been more likely to be locked out of education without adequate access to devices or internet. In school districts that didn't necessarily have the resources to provide professional development for their teachers around online learning. Kids who, in many cases, whose parents had to work outside the home. Only 1 in 5 African Americans in the workforce can work from home. Only 1 in 6 Latinos in the workforce can work from home. So many kids have been navigating their education on their own or with an older sibling. Many kids have had to work during this period to support their family. So this issue of transformational educational opportunity is even more urgent today than it was in February 2020. So what would it take? Well, one thing it would take is we have to reverse our practice as a country of giving the least to the students who need the most. And that begins with early childhood. Today, only about 40% of our 4-year-olds are in public preschool programs. Less than 10% of 3-year-olds are in public preschool programs. We have a early childhood care system that is fractured and in real crisis at the moment. So if we want to provide a truly emancipatory education, we must invest as a country in high quality early childhood education for students beginning with infants all the way through 4 years old. We need to have universal access to high quality pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, and we need to have high quality childcare options. That means we may need to spend more, we may need to tax more in order to have the resources to do that, but it's a worthwhile investment because we know if you participate in high quality early childhood education, you are more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go on to college, more likely to succeed in the workforce. And actually, we have research evidence from James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, that shows your health outcomes in your 30s are better if you went to high-quality early childhood programs. To make sure the programs are high quality, we've got to invest in the early childhood educator workforce. When I was secretary, we did a report that showed in many states, early childhood educators made less than they would make doing nails. Less, despite all the research we have on brain science about the importance of those early years. We've got to invest in our early childhood educators, and we've got to make sure that early childhood education environments are not only building those early academic skills like early literacy and early math understanding, but they're places of joy and play where kids are testing to see if something will float or sink at the water table, where kids are building structures with blocks, right? We have to make sure that the kind of learning we have in early childhood engages students and prepares them for school, but prepares them socio-emotionally to be good peers to their classmates. So what else do we need beyond that early childhood investment? Well, we need to change how we fund our schools. We fund our schools in a way that disproportionately disadvantages low-income students and students of color. We've shown at the Ed Trust a $2,000 per student gap in spending when you compare the districts with the fewest students of color to the districts with the most students of color. We are systematically underinvesting in schools serving students of color, particularly schools serving low-income students of color. And that underinvestment translates into less access to the strongest teachers, less access to counselors, less access to advanced coursework, less access to a well-rounded education that includes art and music and science and social studies. So we've got to radically rethink how we invest in our schools. We have to move away from reliance on property taxes to drive how we fund our schools. We've got to ensure that we are providing for every child what we would want for our own. All right, so early childhood, better school funding. We've also got to think about the curriculum, and that means a few things. One, we've really got to make sure that we have a strong literacy foundation for our students. We have a rich body of knowledge about the science of reading, the importance of building not only students' decoding skills in those early years, but exposing them to rich content knowledge in science, in social studies, and understanding of the world, cultivating their love and joy in reading. But we don't always utilize that science to ensure a strong literacy foundation. When you look at the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, less than 40% of students in 4th and 8th grade are proficient readers. We have a lot of work to do to ensure that all of our students achieve that reading foundation, which we know is so critical to their ability to access all the other subjects as they move through their education. But as we think about curriculum, I want to tie back to the conversation you had with Gloria Ladson Billings and suggest that we also need to think about this question of cultural relevance. And of course, she frames this idea first around rigor. And too often we don't provide rigor to all of our students equitably. Low-income students and students of color are less likely to have access to gifted and talented programs, less likely to have access to 8th grade algebra, less likely to have access to AP courses or international baccalaureate courses. We have to close those rigor gaps. She talks about the idea of cultural competence. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that our curriculum provides all of our students with windows and mirrors, opportunities to see themselves reflected, opportunities to read text by diverse authors, opportunities to encounter narratives about people of color, opportunities to learn history that is honest about the hard parts of our history, the role of slavery, the role of Jim Crow, the role of anti-immigrant sentiment, the role of Japanese American internment, but also that lifts up examples of Black excellence, Latino excellence, Asian American excellence, Native American excellence. And of course, Gloria Ladson-Billings also talks about the idea of socio-political consciousness. And I think about this not only as helping students understand how to navigate the systems in our country that fall short of our values around democracy and equality, but also helping students acquire the tools to create a more just future. Just this week, I wrote an op-ed with 5 other former secretaries of education calling for a renaissance in civic education and a national investment in civic education. We need students to be able to understand the importance not only of voting, but of political participation, the power of protest. I think about standing in front of the White House last spring with my daughters, declaring Black Lives Matter, demanding that folks attend to the value that Black Lives Matter, and standing with a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of folks asking for their government, our government, to change the laws to protect all of its people. And we need to empower our students for that kind of protest. We need to empower our students to follow in the tradition of the young people at UNC Greensboro who sat in at, and North Carolina A&T who sat in at lunch counters. We have to empower our students to follow in John Lewis's footsteps, thinking about him marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, willing to risk his own safety for the sake of the right to vote. So that curricular change is critical. Then I would say, we've got, so early childhood, resources, curricular change. And I would say we've got to focus on educator diversity. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. We have too few teachers who are bilingual. And so we too often deny our students the gift of bilingualism. So we have work to do to make sure our teacher workforce is truly diverse. That means we need pipeline programs that help high school students see the potential for themselves as teachers. We need programs at community colleges that help community college students see a path into 4-year programs that will allow them to become educators. We need programs that get students engaged early in classroom environments, that provide them with good mentoring, and that help support them financially to become educators. And we need to think of teacher preparation not as something that happens just in a bachelor's program or a master's program, but something that happens through the first few years of your career when you should get intensive induction support. And we've got to be attentive to retention of teachers of color. Too often, teachers of color are leaving the profession because of an invisible tax that falls on teachers of color. The experience I had as an African-American male teacher, you're expected to be the disciplinarian. Or the experience many Latino and Latina teachers have of being expected to translate for families. And it's not necessarily that folks don't want those extra responsibilities, but they're often not compensated, they're not recognized, they're not rewarded. And that tax weighs heavily on folks. The last thing I would say that must be an element of this emancipatory vision of education is a commitment to second chances. We have huge discipline disparities in our country based on race. Many communities, girls of color are suspended at 5 times the rate as white female students. We see these patterns beginning in pre-K. we often have in this country, sadly, a school to prison pipeline where students get involved in discipline in K-12, and that leads them into adult prison. We have 1.7 million kids who go to a school where there's a law enforcement officer, but no school counselor. So we have to be a country that's committed to strong environments of socio-emotional support, where students can build relationships with teachers, relationships with peers. We have to replace exclusionary discipline with restorative justice practices. We have to ensure that schools have adequate resources to provide counselors and mental health services. And we have to be willing, even when students make very serious mistakes, to realize the reality of adolescent brain development and give them second chances and support. I needed that as a kid. Even though teachers really helped me have a positive vision of my future, I actually got in a lot of trouble in high school, as is true for many kids who've experienced trauma. I got in so much trouble, I got kicked out of high school. I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education to have been kicked out of high school. But again, teachers intervened, the school counselor intervened. They were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. They were willing to invest more hope in me than I was prepared to invest in myself. They got me back on track. They're the reason I was able to go on to college and become a teacher and principal and have the opportunities I've had in life. So we need an education system that believes in young people's potential and gives young people second chances, third chances, fourth chances. Because we can't afford to lose any of our young people. We can't afford to throw away the potential of any of our young people. So to me, that is the vision of an emancipatory education in the tradition of Frederick Douglass. And I hope we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Secretary King. That was, so much to think about and to chew on as a former history teacher myself. I appreciated the connection around civics education, and somebody looks at the underfunding of really, and the piece about needing to invest more absolutely resonates. But I particularly really appreciated your commitment to second chances framing and your own story. I must admit, I did not get kicked out of high school, but I think about the number of times where I was given a second chance. And I think those of us who, particularly those of us who have privilege, can look back and think about the number of times that we had second or third or fourth chances. And for those of us who have children, the number of times we give our own children second and third and fourth chances. And why is it that we expect that we're going to give those chances to our kids who are our biological children or our adopted children in our own family, but not to our larger community? And I think that's a really critical question. And I appreciate your personal reflection on that. I want to introduce our panelists. So we have three people who are going to provide some opportunity for some Q&A, and would also encourage our participants to put questions in the chat as well. We did collect questions up during the registration time period, so we'll be using and relying on those as well. But we have three people. So Vincent Vu is an undergraduate here at San Jose State in our business administration program, majoring in business administration. And they are also a minor in our child and adolescent development program. And María Ledesma, Dr. María Ledesma is a faculty member in our higher education leadership program, and thrilled to have her here with us. And Vincent Del Casino is our provost and senior vice president for academic affairs at San Jose State University. So take it away. We are thrilled to engage in this conversation.
Thank you so much for your remarks, John King. One thing that really stood out to me from, all the points that you brought up was like the need for change in terms of like the system, like our system's not working right now, and like even before. So here's a question that was submitted from our Q&A. Over the past year, what shifts have you noticed or observed in terms of policies, practices, and priorities? And are there any examples that we should carry over or advocate, in a world post-COVID and beyond?
Well, there's a lot to lament about the last year and the missed opportunities and the lost learning. But a couple things that are hopeful. One is we had a homework gap before COVID, a divide in access to devices and internet. And through a lot of heroic efforts of school districts and some significant federal investment that hopefully will be increased in the next few weeks, we've made some progress on closing that divide. And so it means that students will have access to technology, and that can be a tool for learning, so that teachers going forward will be able to complement in-class instruction with that technology tool, to be able to say, well, we're going to study the ancient pyramids. Well, let's use technology to actually walk inside of the ancient pyramids as part of that study. So that's a hopeful thing. A second thing that's hopeful is that we've seen that we can offer more coursework opportunities to students through the leveraging of technology. I think about Northern Virginia Community College that offered 5 free college courses to any junior or senior in Northern Virginia last summer using federal CARES Act dollars. So we should never again have the situation where a student is told, you can't take that class because we don't have it in this building. Right? If you want to take AP French, it shouldn't depend on whether or not there's an AP French teacher in the building. We should be able to make that available through online learning. So those are a couple things. There's again a lot to lament about the last year, but there are some things that we might leverage into the future.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights.
Thanks, Vincent.
All right, so I get to follow up, Vincent and Dr. King. One of the things that you mentioned was the many roles that institutions, educational institutions need to cover. So we can say that schools have always been multi-purpose institutions. You mentioned how one of the things that need to be addressed, the expectation is the socio-emotional growth, obviously academic growth as well, increasingly health and general well-being, especially in a post-COVID environment. We've seen that schools have really stepped up in terms of addressing food insecurities. So my question to you, gathering from the comments, is if you can speak to the benefit and the burden of institutions of education, K-12 institutions, bearing these weights when, again, the resources are going to be even more constrained going forward.
Yeah. Well, look, I think as educators, we see the hungry students going to struggle to learn. The student who can't see the board or can't read the book because they have unaddressed vision care issues, not going to be able to be as successful. So we know we need to help. We want to help. I think it's incumbent on states to make investments, as well as the federal government, in the schools that serve the highest need students, so that we can provide those services at school, and so that we can have staff at the school who are charged with coordinating those services. I worry sometimes that we burden a principal with managing the day-to-day of instruction, managing all the operations, connecting with parents, managing the faculty, and then we say on top of that, here are these 10 community partners, you need to manage all of those relationships. Instead, what I'd love to see is an investment in a community schools model that says, in a school that's serving high need students, we're going to have a community schools coordinator whose role is to coordinate those other functions, take that off the shoulders of the principal, work in collaboration, of course, with the principal and teachers, but really try to help manage some of those challenges. And actually, Brookings last week put out a paper from a national task force on community schools that I'm a part of that makes a set of recommendations about how the federal government could accelerate those community schools efforts.
Thank you.
Dr. King, thank you so much. It's really insightful, and it's wonderful to have you here at San Jose State. I was thinking as you were talking, my first time in a classroom was 8th grade mathematics in Far Rockaway, Queens, and I know the area. And I remember teaching and being handed a book and saying, they don't know anything, you got to go back to basically 4th grade math. And one day I just wrote the Pythagorean theorem on the board and said, and figured out they knew exactly how to do that intellectually. There was some math behind it. And so there's been a move against remediation, and trying to lift people up and get them to the right places. How do we think about that? And how do we invest in our schools in a way that challenges that remediation culture that we've built up over time, which really creates a lot of the core differences between schools?
Such an important point, and I think critical in this moment as we think about the unfinished instruction of this year. I think the temptation in some places will be to respond with remediation rather than acceleration. And what we should be doing is thinking about it as acceleration. So a couple things about what that might look like. One, we have really good evidence that high dosage tutoring, That is where you're working with a tutor, one-on-one, two-on-one, three-on-one, who's able to really attend to your individualized needs, build a relationship with you. That kind of high dosage tutoring can rapidly accelerate student performance. I think about the Saga education program. It's a nonprofit that works in a number of cities providing math tutoring that's showing really positive results in actually randomized controlled trials. So high dosage tutoring is one lever. Another lever is to think about what is the instruction. I'm sure this is what you were doing in your 8th grade classroom, right? What is the instruction that's going to engage and inspire and help students make that kind of progress? It's what we're seeing, I think, higher ed institutions that build co-requisite classes do effectively, right? Try to inspire students around that Pythagorean theorem, and then within that lesson, right, you're trying to address maybe some gaps around fractions, right? Rather than saying what we're going to start with is a boring worksheet from 4th grade math. Similarly, we should think about this summer and next summer as these opportunities to do great enrichment work, and there'll hopefully be some additional federal dollars to do this that would accelerate students. Think about a robotics program, how you could sneak in some math in the robotics program as you inspire kids around robotics, or you could do science experiments where students have to write up the labs and write down their observations. So you're working on writing, you're working on science content knowledge, but it's fun and engaging and interesting. That's what instruction should always be about, but I think it's even more urgent in this moment.
Thank you so much for your insights on instruction and in terms of changing the kind of model to focus on not giving students a boring worksheet, but something that's practical, tangible, and relevant to today's modern society. Building off that, one of our attendees submitted a question, Katie. Would love to hear your thoughts on shifts in standard testing.
Yeah. I think our dilemma is, as a society, we know that we need to know how kids are doing. Teachers need to know how kids are doing. Parents need to know how kids are doing. Frankly, policymakers need to know how kids are doing. And we have to shine a light on where there are gaps. So I think about before the standards movement, if you think back to even into the 80s and 90s, you had states that didn't even recognize the performance of English language learners. They just ignored them. They were invisible. They didn't even report their performance in any way. We can't go back there. That said, too often I think educators feel like the use of assessments is for blame and punish purposes, as opposed to opportunities to provide support and intervention. So, we're going to have this infusion of federal dollars that's going to be helpful for things like intensive tutoring and summer enrichment. We ought to be thinking about, well, how do we make sure that we target those resources to the students who need the most help? And so the assessment becomes an entry point to supports, and we've got to make the assessments better. Look, no one wants to have kids or teachers spend time on an assessment that is disconnected from the kinds of activities that students would do later in their education and post-secondary and in careers. And we can get there. We can build better assessments that, for example, require you to do an actual science experiment as part of the science assessment, require you to design a mathematical model of a house as part of the math assessment, so that you're actually applying your skills. I'm hopeful that assessments will continue to evolve to be more valuable.
All right. So as someone who studies higher ed, I'm going to take a little higher ed prerogative here and ask you how we can strengthen the relationship between K-12 and higher ed. Obviously, we know that having a bachelor's degree and beyond is no longer optional, is requisite for success in the workforce. So what are your comments?
Yeah, a couple of things I'd love to see more of. So I was involved in an effort to grow and replicate a program called PTech, which is a program that began actually in Brooklyn, where I grew up. It's a partnership between City University of New York City Department of Education, and IBM. And when students graduate from P-TECH, they graduate with a high school diploma, an associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM. And today there are IBM engineers who are alums of the P-TECH program. And that kind of close coordination in program design, right? When they were building P-TECH, they were thinking about, well, what does algebra class need to look like, with the goal in mind of a student being prepared to be a successful engineer at IBM. And so the kinds of activities they were doing in ninth grade algebra look like the kinds of activities that might be asked of an IBM engineer. That kind of design coordination, I think, can be incredibly valuable. So I'd love to see more of that high school college partnership around coursework. I'd love to see more clinically rich teacher preparation. I worry that student teaching is often very short in many states. Really what we should want is for schools and teacher prep institutions to really function in partnership so that the school is almost like a teaching hospital functions, where students really from the beginning of their undergraduate experience are part of the school community. And so they are better prepared when they become a teacher. This is how some of our international competitors think of teacher preparation, much more like the preparation of a doctor, rather than these short, student-teacher stints where you don't really get to know the kids or the classroom or the school community. So those are at least two ways that I think there could be much closer partnership.
Thank you.
I really appreciate some of the kind of comments you made about entry points into the learning process, the ways in which we engage students to think about them critically. The challenge we're facing, and this goes from kindergarten all the way through higher education, is the rapidity with which the workforce is changing, with work itself, the economy is changing, and what we're seeing is actually creativity, the arts coming back in the human capacity to enter into this, and being really diversified in your thinking. Like, people are actually looking back to the liberal arts now, and yet we've divested a lot of our resources from that type of thinking, that teaching. How do we start to demonstrate the demands that are being put on our future, workforce, our future adults now that need access to that kind of education, that diverse, interactive, interdisciplinary thinking?
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right that employers are increasingly looking for those very skills. We sort of haven't caught up, I think, with how our educational investments align. I think part of it is trying to help bridge folks' understanding of how an experience in the arts actually can translate into better outcomes in math, right? If you're designing it right, helping people see the connections between disciplines. I think we function in very siloed form in our classes, and we miss those opportunities. I also think we have to kind of rekindle the spirit of higher education as a place where we prepare the future civic participants in our society. That we need students to be able. Maybe you're not going to do anything in your job that requires math, but you ought to know something about statistics, because when you open up the newspaper, you're going to see a graph, a chart, a poll result, and you're going to need to make sense of that, right? Maybe you're not in the sciences, but you probably need to be able to understand the impact of climate change as we think about what the next 20 years looks like for the country. Or as Steve Jobs understood, maybe you're going to be a coder, but if you want to design an amazing app, you need an appreciation of the arts and how to deploy that.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insights. And I definitely can kind of relate to that too. I feel like even in the higher ed landscape, as a business student who's also interested in child and adolescent development, there's also that weird culture there where students don't really understand my interdisciplinary interests, and faculty as well. So I can definitely connect to that point that you brought up. And as a question to you, I was kind of curious to learn more about what you think educators can do at the different levels to create inclusion for students, families, and future teachers as well.
Yeah. Well, look, the inclusion challenge, I think, to me, has taken on even more urgency as we have confronted this moment of national reckoning with issues of racial justice. I think about all the institutions last spring, higher ed institutions, corporations, school districts that put out these statements of solidarity with the movement for racial justice, said Black Lives Matter, but then the follow through wasn't there, right? So if you're a higher ed institution and you say Black Lives Matter, but you don't enroll Black students, I don't know if your statement is that meaningful. If you're a higher ed institution and you say Black Lives Matter and you don't have Black faculty, how meaningful was your statement? If you're a higher ed institution and you say Black Lives Matter, but students encounter an environment of microaggressions and racial hostility and walk past buildings named after enslavers, how serious is your commitment to those pledges? So I think that the inclusion challenge is really about, as an institution, reorienting to your students and saying, how do I create an environment where students feel a sense of safety and belonging? And that requires attending to students' cultural experience. It requires attending to students to an appreciation that LGBTQ students are often made to feel unsafe and uncomfortable on campus if there aren't clear institutional practices to create a safe and supportive environment. It means that institutions have to look at their hiring practices. They have to look at the choices that they make around community events and what signals they're sending to students. And that kind of vigilant holding up of a mirror too often doesn't happen. People get away with performative wokeness, and what we need is actually policy wokeness. We need them to deliver on the rhetoric.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to claim host privilege for one more last question. And with that idea of performative wokeness and your prior role as Secretary of Education, what would you tell our now confirmed new Secretary of Education, Secretary Cardona, around how to address some of these issues so that it's not performative, so that there is substantive change that comes out of these next 4 or 8 or however many years, particularly around some of the structural and systemic issues that you laid out so clearly in your presentation?
Yeah. Well, if you think about the federal role in education, it really goes back to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Right, a civil rights law signed by Lyndon Johnson, himself a former teacher. He signed the law in front of the one-room schoolhouse he attended in Texas with his teacher from that school sitting right next to him. And he talked about education as a passport from poverty, right? And then it was a similar spirit behind the Higher Education Act, right? These were civil rights laws that Lyndon Johnson signed and pushed forward because he thought education could be a tool for racial equity and social mobility. And so that's the spirit. Now, the department didn't come into existence until the Carter administration, but that's the legacy that the department must uphold. And so the two things that I have said to Secretary Cardona and that I hope he will act on, one is we have to restore the civil rights enforcement capacity of the department. Betsy DeVos really walked away from that civil rights enforcement role, but it's critical. And when I was secretary, we had a district we investigated where we looked at the advanced STEM programs in the district, and there were very few Latino students, even though there were many Latino students in the district. And we came to find out that the information only went home in English. So if your parents didn't speak English and didn't read English, you weren't going to have any access to that program. And so we made the district change it. That's the job of the department, enforce civil rights law. So that's one. Two, an equity focus means investment of resources. President Biden talked during the campaign about tripling Title I. That would go a long way towards more equitable funding in K-12. And he talked during the campaign about doubling Pell. Pell Grants are the main federal support for low-income students. In 1980, Pell Grants accounted for about 80% of the cost. I don't need to tell you all this, you know this. In 1980, Pell Grants accounted for 80% of the cost of a public four-year college. Today, it's about 28%. So doubling Pell will be a good start towards the kind of federal investment we need to create equity, to create access for low and moderate income students to higher education.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your insights and sharing your wisdom with all of us. Very much appreciate, especially on a Friday evening where it is late your time. So thank you so much for giving your time and your wisdom.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. And now as we transition to Dr. Gonzales, Maria is going to provide an introduction.
Yes, thank you. So good afternoon again, everyone. My name is María Ledesma, and it is my distinct pleasure to be with you today to introduce Dr. Gonzales. As a first-generation scholar, Dr. Gonzales received her doctorate in educational leadership in higher education from the University of Texas, El Paso, earning the distinction of Dissertation of the Year. Since that time, Dr. Gonzales has continued to excel as a stellar researcher and pedagogue. As evidenced by her curriculum vitae, Dr. Gonzales' experiences, recognitions, and accolades are vast and well-deserved. Dr. Gonzales not only made significant contributions to has not only made significant contributions to the understanding of issues that disproportionately affect minoritized populations, her research has been consistently recognized as adding timely and significant contributions to education research and development, especially as related to supporting BIPOC faculty. At present, Dr. Gonzales is an associate professor in educational administration department and an affiliate faculty member in Chicano Latino Studies at Michigan State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leslie Gonzales.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Ledesma. It's so wonderful to see you this evening. I have a slate of thank yous that I want to go ahead and start with. So I'm just going to jump in and move into my comments. First, I want to thank all of the audience members or folks who might watch this in a few weeks on the recording. I know your time is worth gold, especially in this current context, so thank you. I want to say a special thank you to Mr. Brian Chiang Dooley and Miss María Munoz, who pulled together all the logistics. There's always backstage labor that goes into making sure these things happen, so thank you for your efforts. I want to just give a real big thank you to Dean Lattimer and your entire team for creating the space at San Jose State University's College of Education to have these kinds of conversations. I've been tracking some of what's been happening at San Jose State College of Education, and it's really an honor to be a part of this effort, to be a part of this legacy. So thank you. And I just have two small additional thank yous and recognitions. I want to say thank you and recognize Dr. Burciaga and Dr. Ledesma for your steady friendship and guidance. It was such a gift to receive an invitation from you all. And so I'm just so glad to have you in my life and to be connected to you. I'm really grateful. Before I move into my comments tonight, I want to recognize that I'm situated on land of the Anishinaabe peoples. This includes the three fires of the Confederacy, the Ojibwa, and the Potawatomi peoples. Specifically, I reside on land that was ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw, and I offer this public acknowledgement as a way to hold myself accountable and making sure that I'm working with and for Native and Indigenous communities, not only here in Michigan, but anywhere in this land that we now call the United States. So thank you. I want to go ahead and share with you that when I received the invitation for this talk to reimagine or to think about education post-COVID through an emancipatory lens, I didn't even know where to start. There was so much that I wanted to share. And I started thinking about this very helpful concept from Naomi Klein that is called disaster capitalism. In short, Naomi Klein says that in moments of disaster, there are always powerful interests that have the only resources and capacity with which to make moves and to consolidate power, resources, agendas. And I stayed thinking about that, and I thought, how is disaster capitalism impacting higher education and academia? And it made me think about the importance of creating space and securing space for historically minoritized populations in academia. This isn't necessarily a new issue. This has been an issue with academia for years. And so tonight I want to share with you a talk that I have titled, if I can get my slideshow on, a talk that I have titled, Towards Epistemic Justice, Unlearning, Relearning, and Refusal in the Academy. To get us started, I want to share with you one of my most favorite quotes from Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, about 30 years ago, wrote, "The Academy is not paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move boundaries, to transgress. This is education as a practice of freedom." When I read this passage the first time, and every time since then, I remain inspired. I remain inspired about what it might look like to have an academy where all of us fit, particularly historically minoritized populations. And today, as I read this quote, and as I think about the academy in the context of COVID, I remain ever mindful of the work that remains undone. For example, in the opening pages of Dr. Mariana Ortega's book, she wrote, "Feeling comfortable in the world of philosophy has not been easy for me. This book is my home tactic, my attempt at finding a sense of belonging and ease within a discipline that forgets the contributions of those regarded as others. If philosophy remembers them, it does so with piercing abstraction and condescension." Tonight, I'm going to ask you to imagine emancipation through the concept of epistemic justice. My comments, like Hooks' work, like Mariana Ortega's work, will center on the academy. I want us to think about epistemic justice in the academy because this is a space in colleges and universities where there is so much possibility, where there is so much potential for beauty, but often it's a place that just causes harm and marginalization. For me, emancipation, or using an emancipatory lens, means getting to ultimate freedom for all. And in the academy, what this means is getting to a place where all people, but especially historically marginalized and minoritized people, Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans, disabled, the poor, are recognized as knowers, and that they have the opportunity to articulate knowledges in any way we may choose to do. In my work, I call this epistemic justice. This is a state where every person is seen and valued as a knower, where a scholar of color is seen as a full person capable of a rich intellectual agenda and not simply someone who might do diversity work for the department, where a graduate of an open access minority serving institution might be taken just as seriously as the graduate from Harvard. Unfortunately, the history of the academy is entrenched in whiteness, in the privilege of wealth, and in masculine power. And often, who gets into the academy is merely a series of acts that lead to the consolidation of white exclusionary power. Once in the academy, we minoritized and marginalized scholars, we have a few choices. We often must contort ourselves to fit inside the crooked walls of academia. We play the game, hoping to survive, praying we don't lose ourselves in the process. Or we speak out, covertly, overtly, resisting, refusing, but risking being labeled a troublemaker or simply just not the right fit for the department. In my work, I call all of these judgments, all of these acts, epistemic policing. Epistemic policing is essentially the application of rules and norms used by power holders within the academy to maintain not only their privilege, but the fundamental structure and logic of the academy. Sometimes power holders are hiring and search committees, as we have seen in the work of Dr. Román Liera. And sometimes they are the tenure promotion or fellowship committees, as we have seen in the work of Delgado Bernal and Villalpando. No matter who it comes from or how it happens, epistemic policing keeps the academy from epistemic justice. Tonight, I'm going to draw on research that will call out two distinct forms of epistemic policing in order to consider what it might look like to refuse and unlearn these habits. The first form of epistemic policing might surprise you: classification. Higher education researchers love a good classification system. Some of you might say, well, Leslie, this is inevitable. We have more than 3,000 colleges and universities in the United States, in this land that we call the United States. We need to know how to count them and organize them in some sensible way. However, I argue, like every other hierarchy in the US, how we classify and understand institutional types in US higher education is a product of colonialism, anti-Black racism, and racism. Let's just consider, for example, the formation of the HBCU land grants, sometimes called the 1890 HBCUs. In 1862, the original Morrill Act was signed. In this act, the federal government took land and resources that it had previously stolen from Native and Indigenous peoples and allocated them to states in order to form land grant institutions. Recently, Indigenous community members and activists have more accurately renamed these institutions as land grab institutions. In 19, there was a follow-up to the original Morrill Act. This is often called the Second Morrill Act. The Second Morrill Act promised mostly Southern Confederate states resources as long as they provided Black students access to higher education and at least one other institutions. Southern states responded and erected what are known as the 1890 land grant HBCUs. These were essentially separate institutions that Black students could attend, as Southerners didn't want Black and white folks in the same college or university. From the very start of the 1890s, these institutions were cheated. Researchers have shown that throughout their history, they have never been fully funded, and they have never been as generously funded as other land grant institutions. Dr. James Anderson's research has revealed that HBCUs were not allowed to establish a full curriculum. Instead, Black students there were limited to a more technical or more vocationally oriented learning. Racist practices informed their funding. Racist ideas informed how Black students were understood as potential knowers. This is just one story that can help us more critically assess how classification systems in US higher education were born and how they have imprinted certain ideas about where knowers and knowledge production happens in higher education. Similar, though not the same, kind of stories exist for the formation and treatment of other minority-serving institutions. Tribal colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, Anapizis have all had to fight to be recognized. They've all had to fight to be funded. They've suffered from a historical lack of underinvestment and deficit-based conceptions about what kinds of learning, teaching, and researching is possible in these institutions. We can also think about the story of normal or teaching schools, which have evolved into regional or broad access institutions, many of which are also minority-serving institutions. All of these schools are the schools where the majority of students of color, poor, disabled folks often start their academic journeys. But these are not the kinds of schools that the Academy thinks about when we think about the intellectual promise of possibility, where we imagine interesting and valuable scholarly work happening. This is, I argue, because our conceptions of higher learning are bound up in a tiny portion of highly exclusionary, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly wealthy institutions like the Harvards or the Stanfords or the Columbias, we are unable, perhaps unwilling, to imagine broad access institutions, regional institutions, HSIs, like San Jose State, or like UTEP, where I graduated from, as legitimate sites of knowledge producers and knowledge production. The last 20 years of research bears out this fact really well. For example, in 2004, Wu conducted a study to look at the doctoral origins of tenure-line faculty members at the top 25 research and liberal arts colleges. Wu used the 2004 US News World Report to identify the top 25 in each of these categories. The slide that you're looking at shows the faculty hiring and origins of doctorate at the top research universities. You can see that across all the disciplines that Wu looked at, 50 to 85% of the faculty obtained their doctoral degree from a top 10 or top 20 institution. In the liberal arts colleges, Wu found similar numbers, but with a bit of variation. And let me pull that slide up for you. What's incredibly important to note is when you dig into the data and you look at these top institutions, very few, if any, of these institutions are recognized as minority-serving institutions, broad access institutions. We also have more recent studies, if the 2004 study is too old for your taste. In 2015, the Closet Lab published a fairly groundbreaking study. Closet and colleagues hand-curated data for nearly 19,000 faculty hires across 242 schools in the US and in Canada. They limited their hand-curated data collection to computer science, history, and economics. The spread and diversity of their disciplines was intentional. They wanted to capture disciplines that they thought would behave quite differently. After controlling for size of department and doctoral productivity, Closet and colleagues found something that is not quite surprising to me, but was quite surprising when you look at it all together. They found what they call a steep prestige hierarchy, one in which most faculty are produced and then hired inside a very small cluster of universities. They suggested that about 60 institutions in their sample produced between 71 and 86% of all faculty hires. 71 to 86% of 19,000 faculty hires came from just about 60 programs. To make that even clearer, just 18 elite universities produced half of all computer science professors, 16 schools produced about half of all business professors, and 8 schools accounted for half of all history professors. One of the really powerful aspects of Closet's study is that they didn't go in with a ranking in mind. They actually looked at faculty and organizational decision-making. When we look at this small circle of institutions from the Closet Lab, it's immediately evident that there is no overlap with MSIs or broad access regional colleges and universities. This is a perfect example of how classification serves as a policing tool in the academy, how the schemas we so casually use to organize and understand higher education can pull people up or push them out, yielding an academy that is deeply stratified by race and gender. Let's just consider, for example, that the most secure and well-paid segment of academia are tenure-line faculty, of which white men and white women dominate 66% of all those positions. What this means is that the remaining 34% of tenure-line faculty is spread across Black, Latinx, Indigenous, mixed race, as well as faculty born outside of the US. However, I have some additional news. The vast majority of faculty in the US are not on a tenure-line position. In fact, 74% of all professors in the US work in contingent or non-tenure-line positions. And this is where we see the most growth of women and faculty of color, especially Black women and Latinas. In fact, Finkelstein cautioned that although women of color have made gains in the academy over the last 20 years or so, Black and Latina women have made gains in the most vulnerable segments of the academy. Specifically, they're concentrated in the part-time segment of contingent faculty. So if we think about contingent faculty, they have part-timers, full-timers. Black and Latina women are focused in the part-time segment of that faculty. You might be asking, well, how is this connected to epistemic justice? What are the connections here? Well, researchers have established that part-time contingent faculty are most likely to be paid the least, to hold short-term, likely semesterly contracts. They're most likely to be hired at the very last minute, and they're most likely to be fired at the first signs of economic trouble, as we have seen during COVID. Part-time faculty, again, where Black and Latina women are focused, often do not have access to institutionally provided benefits such as healthcare, retirement, or even professional development funds and technology. Some contingent faculty have reported that they have inconsistent access to library holdings and email once their contract ends. And recent reporting by the Chronicle found that in light of changing working conditions due to COVID, contingent faculty are increasingly food and shelter insecure. Laboring under such conditions, how is it possible to engage in deep, sustained work? If we know the academy values work that is research related, how are these women supposed to be able to focus on that kind of work under these conditions? Now let's consider what happens when we are inside the academy. The second form of epistemic policing that I want to call out is related to the evaluation of scholars, particularly scholars of color, once we are located in tenure-line positions. In much of my research, I have asked questions like, what does it take to be viewed as legitimate in the academy? And I have consistently found that beyond institutional affiliation, which I just talked about, legitimizing knowledge and thereby knowers exposes how deeply academics hold on to disciplinary norms and epistemological habits of mind that privilege whiteness and Western science, often under the facade of quality or rigor. Indeed, much of my interviewing work aligns with what Burciaga and Tavares have recently observed, that there continues to be an apartheid of knowledge in education settings, including in the academy, so that the knowledge that is most valued from preschool to the professoriate is based on Eurocentric notions of intellect. Indeed, I have found that in evaluating knowledge, in evaluating scholars, particularly at points of tenure promotion or similar sorts of situations, epistemic policing emerges almost always with racialized and gendered effects in three ways. First, when a scholar's work unsettles core assumptions of one's discipline. For example, in one study, I spoke with a Black woman in social science field who explained to me, I have never and will never be published in the core journals of my discipline. I start with race. And my discipline, it's all about class, it's all about gender. But starting with race, nah. This scholar's comments were not a rarity. In fact, it was pretty common when a scholar, particularly a scholar of color, started with race as their organizing framework. And if that wasn't normative to their discipline, they often were not published in some of their core or key mainstream journals. Second, when a scholar's work disrupts or fully dismantles Western ways of knowing and knowledge production in terms of the actual methodological approach and presentation of research. For example, in the same study, I interviewed a self-described Mexican-American working class woman. She explained to me why she never really fit into the academy and that her dissertation committee didn't quite know what to do with her. She said, there seemed to be a disconnect between what I was learning, what I call intellectual knowledge, and the reality that I saw with my family. This woman was unwilling to maintain that disconnect. She began to incorporate not only knowledge, but research methods learned from her mother. Drawing on customs learned from her mother while watching her work in the kitchen, this woman arranged for interviews or pláticas to take place over home-cooked meals at her own personal kitchen table. Rather than utilize pre-formed protocols in the ways that she had been taught in graduate school, this woman engaged her participants as full and knowing humans, usually starting with some chisme or small talk, never knowing when the interview really started or where it ended. The third scenario, when a scholar's work goes out of bounds or addresses questions not deemed appropriate for that area. For example, a Black woman that I interviewed expressed how her approach to her work has meant that she hasn't been necessarily accepted or celebrated as others have been in her department. She described to me the evolution of her work. Before, my work was much more discipline-based. It's not that I didn't necessarily like that. I was interested in that. But as I was doing that, I realized how important the sociocultural aspects are to language. I started to move into issues of language and identity within the sociocultural and then also a historical context. I realized that all those things were important, that I didn't want to let go of any of them. I needed to make that shift. For me, part of doing this work is part of helping people, and I didn't see how my discipline was going to help me do that. In each of these cases, we can see how epistemic policing involves scholars of color, particularly Black and Latina women, making themselves or contemplating making themselves legible or digestible to evaluative committees that are not only likely to be staffed by a majority of white folks, but more importantly, that are likely to be anchored in white Western ways of knowing, narrow, governed by notions of objectivity and distance. And so we've arrived at the part of the talk where I've shared all of this with you. I've maybe unsettled us a bit. And my task now is to put some concrete ideas and steps on the table as to how we might move forward. My ideas circulate around three things: unlearning, relearning, and refusal. Unlearning requires us to intentionally and willfully set aside habits, taken for granted processes, and convenient knowledge in order to learn, counter, or new ways of organizing our world. At a really practical level, this means I would like us to consider how much we rely on classifications, which are almost always some sort of hierarchy, almost always tied to some sort of colonial logic or racism in some way. How do we use these classifications because they're convenient to inform how we think about higher education, how we think about how and where scholars reside in the academy? We should work hard to unearth the histories of classifications. How do we know what we know about classifications? Do we know where these said framings come from? Is there a critical or hidden history on this topic? This also means that there's room for relearning. Relearning requires us to intentionally invest in new vocabularies, new schemas, new ways of doing and understanding our work. This can be especially important in the context of faculty evaluation. I am always shocked at how unwilling some academics can be when it comes to embracing and playing with new ideas, new frameworks, new knowledge, allowing new ideas to come into their fields. Anytime that I'm involved in evaluative activity, and I feel like I don't have the knowledge base to assess the work, I know I need to do some basic homework. I know I need to do some learning to help me situate the scholar's work. It is not their fault that I have not read or been exposed to particular bodies of work. I would like for us to imagine every evaluated committee in academia, especially at promotion and tenure time, to approach their work with a learning orientation in mind. What would it take for evaluative committees to get familiar with work, to open themselves up to new ideas? What could this process look like? And finally, refusal. Refusal is a word that I learned from my sister scholar, Dr. Heather Schotten, who learned the concept from Dr. Audra Simpson. Refusal means that we start from a radically different place that is not concerned with the values, rules, and norms that prop up academia to begin with. Practically speaking, this may mean we as scholars refusing to acknowledge or operate according to disciplinary boundaries, refusing to acknowledge or operate our work through a capitalist framework that prizes individuality instead of collective work. Refusal is where our personal agency as scholars comes into play, because we cannot completely leave this work in the hands of an institution that was not made for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your remarks, Leslie. And it was really interesting to hear how how the higher education system works in terms of like hiring practices, in terms of tenure track faculty, and the barriers that exist for scholars to be able to get their research published. What are your thoughts on higher ed scholars in terms of what colleagues can do to support one another and their BIPOC colleagues?
Thank you for the question, Vincent. Thank you for being here this evening. So I think the last piece of the talk really focused around fostering a learning culture can be incredibly important. For example, I've been in situations where there's some sort of evaluation process in play, and maybe somebody doesn't understand how a particular colleague's work is framed. They're not familiar with the body of work. They're not familiar with a particular theory or with a particular methodology. Why is there not more of a learning orientation involved in the evaluation process? One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is what would it look like to have, and I know that some institutions have this, but to have an advocate, not only an advocate for the scholar, but an advocate who was thoroughly familiar with the scholar's work and who could help to frame it and place it in a broader conversation. Oftentimes when, evaluative research, cognitive research has shown that when we're making assessments, when we're making evaluations, we often go to schemas that are really helpful. We're looking for some way to kind of map back on to knowledge that we have. And I think that that could be a really important strategy for fostering, helping evaluators kind of map new concepts onto the concepts that they're familiar with. Thanks for that question.
Leslie, thank you so much for your talk. I think you gave us so much food for thought. But I think what you also pointed out is the vast work ahead, like the enormity of the change that needs to happen. So my question to you is that in light of that, what are some essential first steps that you feel need to happen to get us towards a direction where we are having this learning orientation?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, I'm going to kind of I'm not going to avoid the question, but I'm going to answer with sort of a different, I'm going to start from a different place. I've been thinking a lot about how institutions, just like Dr. King said, they're all about diversity until it really comes to making those hard core investments and really looking at the data that they don't want to look at, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the first steps that I would recommend is that institutions, first and foremost, they've got to get it. Well, they need to take a look at all the various ways that they classify folks that serve some sort of faculty role, right? Because we know if we think about the professoriate or if we think about the academic workforce, there's folks that serve in a lot of different kinds of roles. Typically, we think about tenure-line faculty and contingent faculty, and then the sort of little subgroups beneath, right? Mm-hmm. But there are folks that have teaching classifications or who are recognized as research associates, postdoctoral scholars. We have folks that are called senior researchers, and all of these folks are contributing to the core mission of colleges and universities, teaching and learning and research production, right? However, institutions have figured out that if they classify them in different ways, first of all, they can say, oh, we have a more diverse teaching force, but they don't necessarily talk about where the more racial, gender diverse faculty are situated, right? And that's because we haven't really held institutions' feet to the fire, so to speak, to really have them clean up that data. And there's some really interesting, Adriana Kizar's new book, The Gig Economy, has talked about how it's really important how we hold institutions accountable and have them speak truthfully to how many different classifications that people that hold faculty or faculty-like roles are categorized under in the institution. I think that's one of the key first steps. And I think also, I'll just say this sort of with COVID being at the front of my mind, we know that more than 250 plus institutions have made some sort of layoff, pay cut, furlough since, spring of 2020. When we look at that data really hard, we know that contingent employees have been the hardest hit with those pay cuts, furloughs, et cetera, et cetera. And if we think about what the data on sort of labor market trends, the broader data on labor market trends says, is that contingent employees get hit harder first. And that's also where folks of color are most likely to be situated. So I would like institutions, before they institute any sort of policy, to take a look at the demographic data, understand who's going to be hit. Oftentimes these, I remember last summer, there were these like universal pay cuts that were put into place in several institutions. And it wasn't until faculty, students, staff started organizing and saying, no, we cannot be putting in a universal pay cut which means that a custodial staff person making $24,000 a year, similar salary to what the average contingent part-time faculty member makes, getting a pay cut that is equivalent to the pay cut of, a VP that's making 150 grand or whatnot. So I would like institutions to really look at the data and understand who's going to be affected in the cuts that are being made in sort of the COVID context.
Thank you.
Up to our next question from one of our audience members, Peggy. How can we bring the experiences and teaching methods of non-European communities and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think something that's really interesting, so I have a few things in mind. I think that work is happening. I think that work has been happening for a really long time. I don't think that work has been valued, right? This is sort of the point of the talk. It hasn't been valued in ways, it's been sort of marginalized. It's been policed out of the academy oftentimes. So folks, first of all, are doing that work and have been doing it for a long time. A few things that kind of come to mind. I think that there are some fantastic outlets that publish work that really are grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing, or that are just grounded in a desire to not reproduce European sort of thought or whiteness, white logics. So I'm thinking about really getting to understand the lay of the land in terms of journal diversity. I know that I'm guilty of this. Like, as a higher education scholar, when I was very early on the tenure track, I really didn't know a lot of journals outside of like the core journals. I didn't. I hadn't been introduced to that in my classes. I hadn't really read work in a lot of different places. I think this is a really common story for a lot of us. So with that in mind, I think another thing we can do is, as we go about teaching our classes in graduate education, undergraduate education, think about pulling in research, scholarship that exists in a lot of different venues, and exposing the next generation of scholars to the diversity of places where work exists is, I think, a good strategy.
So I have the benefit of asking you the last question. And my question to you is, we've talked a lot about the work that lies ahead of us. Can you highlight some best practices and what we can learn from them?
So I'll draw a little bit on some of what I've learned in my role as faculty advocate in the College of Education here at Michigan State. In that role, I had the opportunity to participate and to sort of, for lack of a better word, audit searches and practices within searches, hiring practices. And so I think some of the key things that I've seen that are helpful for helping us to get outside of our heads and not rely on like these really lazy classification systems, right? That can lead us to hire from the very same places, from people doing the very same kinds of work. Having in place throughout the hiring process an advocate or a diversity officer, these are folks are named differently, having somebody who can help the hiring committee not only understand what implicit bias is. We already know the limits of implicit bias, right? Like we have to do that training, but we also have to know the limits. But I think also what's really key is having somebody who is trained to be able to intervene and call out when implicit bias is happening. And, you know, I'll suggest the work of Dr. Roman Liera and all of the work from, you know, Dr. Estela Ben-Simon's center. I know that she's retired now, but I'm thinking about all the work that has come out of the Center for Urban Education there and all the cool work that they did around hiring practices. So I think one, having equity advocates or advocates that are well-trained, not just in saying this is what implicit bias is, but this is how you intervene. This is how you help to steer the conversation in another direction. I think also I really want to continue to think about the value of implementing equity officers, or again, something of that kind of role inside tenure and promotion processes. But kind of to what I said earlier when responding to Vincent is, I think that in the context of tenure and promotion, evaluation and review, there's an opportunity for that equity officer to orient the committee to a more learning perspective, to more of a learning orientation. I think that might be useful. I think being able to have somebody who can orient a committee to a scholar's work, have them be able to kind of map on a scholar's work to things that they may know, I think that could gain some traction. I haven't done it. I think that's something that I want to kind of start to play around with and think about whether it works out well or not in practice.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I am going to selfishly ask one more question. As somebody who is a dean in a college of education and engaged in a university leadership role, it's really helpful. And I think, you know, what you've described further clarifies some of the inequities and injustices that we see on a daily basis. And so recognizing what those are and having conversations around how to address those is really critical. And having a vision of what to aim for is also something that it feels like is really important. So if you could imagine a university that centered our BIPOC students, centered our BIPOC faculty, what would that look like?
Gosh, you know, so I think I'm going to start with something that's really just fundamental. And I'm thinking again about Bell Hook's work. She talks about, you know, if we want to imagine or transformation or possibility, we have to be really grounded in concrete realities. And so with that, I think that the first thing is making sure that the schools that enroll BIPOC students are well resourced. There's so much evidence every which way possible that, you know, whether it's minority serving institutions, broad access institutions, regional colleges and universities, these places are just not as well funded as already very wealthy institutions. So I think that first of all, these institutions would be well and generously funded. I think one of the things that I want to comment on is an institution that centers BIPOC students would center them, what is the word I'm looking for? Without abandon, I guess that's the expression I'm looking for. What I mean by that is I've seen in many cases where regional institutions, knowing that they're in a field that really values sort of cultural notions of legitimacy, prestige, status, reputation, regional institutions can sometimes get sort of distracted or want to chase missions that would detract from really serving their community. And I'm not saying that this is like sort of a choice between access and excellence. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I'm saying that sometimes regional institutions or institutions that don't have as much wealth, they get sort of distracted by wanting to serve in other kinds of ways. And I think that an institution that really centered the institution, there's BIPOC students and BIPOC communities, would look at these folks, would look at BIPOC students, communities, families as full partners. You know, I'm thinking, this is like a big dream, but I'm thinking about like the important work of Funds of Knowledge. And what would it look like? What would it really look like to have an institution that tapped into its communities' knowledges and histories, and whether that's located in labor practices, linguistic practices, and figure out ways to fold that in to the architecture, to student programming, to the ways in which they encourage their faculty to interact, to shape their work. I think that's what a BIPOC-centered institution would look like in practice.
Well, I love that. And I hope that I live to see that big dream realized, and would love to work alongside you in helping to create that big dream become a reality. So thank you so much. We really, really appreciate all of the time and energy and thought and insight that you provided today. And just grateful to be in community with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for hosting me, and thank you everyone for joining in.
Thank you. And with that, we will say a big thank you to everybody who came and participated today. I want to make sure that we recognize our outstanding speakers. So thank you so much to Dr. Leslie Gonzales, to Secretary John King. Thank you to our panelists, Vincent Vu, Dr. María Ledesma, Provost Del Casino, as well as to Jennifer Husbands for making the connection with Secretary King, to Brian Chongduli and Maria Munoz for providing behind the scenes support, and to all of you who participated on a Friday afternoon. I hope that you have some downtime this weekend. It is a crazy time for all of us who are working in the midst of a pandemic to support students and communities. And so make sure that you're good to yourselves, that you take care of yourselves, so that you can continue doing the work and work for what matters. Thank you so much. Please join us next week. We will have a Latinas Leading Schools panel as well as Dr. Tara Yoso. Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.